Thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. I guess my question follows Ben's. He presented this very worrisome scenario, picture of where we stand. So my question is, how can people close their eyes? How can people deny the climate crisis? What are they up to? And what does this mean for policy science? How should we approach this? Which is also where Ben concluded. The task of policy science, of course, is to provide policy decision makers with the best available empirical information. In fact, the discipline has largely evolved around evidence-oriented, relatively technocratic methods and principles. This has been especially the case in environmental policy making, given the strong technical component related to the issue. Nowhere are empirical facts more important than in climate change policy, where the IPCC, where its empirical projections concerning global warming have been central to political and policy debates. Indeed, no other factual information has been more fundamental to the rise of post-truth and the emergence of alternative facts, one of the most troubling political issues of our turbulent time. Post-truth is defined, I'm not very good at remembering to do this, post-truth is defined as a situation in which the facts become less important, with the role of emotions coming to play a stronger role in public policy. Needless to say, this becomes a serious concern for an evidence-based policy analysis, an evidence-informed policy analysis, especially in climate change policy. It's led environmental scientists and policy experts, not surprisingly, to argue that the public is irrational. We showed them the facts and they just don't get it. With the main strategy being more and better policy-related facts, along with fact-checking, something of a media obsession, at least if you watch CNN. Accompanying this has been a wide-ranging discussion about how this came about, this climate denial. How, in a time of complex environmental problems, could so many people give up on the idea of truth and facts? In both the academic and popular journalistic literature, it has been common to point the finger at postmodernism, postmodern philosophy, and its social constructivist view of knowledge. In fact, just the other day here, somebody asked me how to explain that, and what should they tell their positivist colleagues who say that it's postmodernism. But I argue this is based on a misunderstanding as it relates to both constructivism and climate denial. Actually, I have a paper in critical policy studies that spells this out. First, it should be noted that there is scant evidence that the deniers are sitting around reading Karl Mannheim, Peter Berger, and Luckman. But more to the point, social constructivism does not belong to postmodernism. It has its own long history and precedes postmodernism. Moreover, there are various forms of constructivism, some related to a political agenda, and some are essentially a methodological perspective. Following Berger, who was actually a conservative economist, a sociologist who often engaged in public debates, he insisted that social constructivism had nothing to do with postmodernism. It is important, he argued, to rescue the methodological orientation from the critique of postmodernism, especially when it comes to understanding climate denial. Rather than bearing the responsibility for climate denial, it is in fact the way, this is my argument, to understand how post-truth arguments are constructed. Without going into detail here, constructivism is a contextual orientation for understanding social action and the reasons that motivate it. Check this out here. Yeah, it's okay. A contextual orientation for understanding social action and the reasons that motivate it. It's enough here to say that constructivism makes clear that there are subjective elements involved in the construction of knowledge, environmental or otherwise. It's grounded as such in social meanings drawn from the social system of which the investigators are themselves a part. Environmental knowledge, like all knowledge, is understood as constructed by a community of inquirers, as opposed to the outcome of purely objective measurement and analysis. It recognizes that the environmental science community, to recognize that it is actually a social group, like any social group, with interests, hierarchies, and purposes that can be studied sociological, and that's what scholars of science studies do in significant part. But this does not mean that there are no environmental facts or that everything is relative. It's rather that environmental facts are the products of an informed consensus with the scientific community, and that new understandings of empirical realities, by their very nature of the process, are subject to reconsideration and revision. The value of constructivism lies in the fact in its effort to understand the way objective and subjective factors interact to form such a consensus, a point that climate denial arguments serve to illustrate. When we look closer, take a closer look, we see that it is social factors rather than the facts that mainly motivate these climate deniers. In particular, the implications of the climate data for their ideological beliefs. Okay, they deny the data and so forth, but it's not really what concerns them. As Naomi Klein has shown, based on her attendance at a Heartland Institute annual conference. Heartland Institute is the home base of climate denial. The debates were primarily about the social implications of the evidence rather than the evidence herself. This was her basic observation. Climate change, oops, let me do this here. There's Manhamid Berger, and here is Klein. Climate change politics, the deniers argue, is more about shackling capitalism and the American way of life than it is about environmental conditions. Environmentalism is seen to advance, these are their arguments, distilled, summarized, environmentalism is seen to advance causes, this is their words, dear to the political left. Redistribution of wealth, higher taxes, greater government intervention, regulation, and is portrayed as a green Trojan horse, a strategy to steal individual freedom, protected by type 2 analysis, by imposing a left political agenda. That's what they worry about. Others go further, arguing that the IPCC climate scientists are the functionaries of a hidden cabal of deep state subversives made up of Democrats, intelligence community members, high-level global officials, numerous celebrities, and nefarious policy elites. As some deniers conclude themselves, the data is actually not their pressing issue, leading Klein to realize that it isn't the real message. Rather, the message is that revered ideas and values of American culture, Western culture, are under frontal attack and in serious jeopardy. As one put it, the recipe for massive increase in government, that's the recipe. Before we take this step, let's take another look at the science. Another says, let's not simply accept this as an article of faith, these numbers. Let's actually do our own research. And this is really pretty rich, but they call for the proper use of scientific procedures. This can be written off as a stall tactic, which it surely in part is, but deniers can formally argue, albeit cynically, that the case has not been proven. What does that mean? Given that climate change data has not in fact been proven, so the argument, it cannot be the basis for policymaking. They even draw on mainstream epistemologies to argue that the data cannot be falsified, citing Karl Popper, which is a clever argument. Instead of proof, the scientific community forms a consensus based on a large amount of evidence that points to climate change's statistical likelihood. But this is seen to be of lesser importance. As Klein concludes, it's not primarily opposition to the scientific facts that is driving this debate. Rather, it's the opposition to the real-world implications of the findings. Climate change, in short, threatens to detonate the ideological scaffolding on which conservatism rests. Klein concluded with this quite interesting passage. This is an article in The Nation. If you actually just Google her name and capitalism versus climate, you'll get this. She concludes with an interesting message for the political left. As she puts it, when it comes to the real-world consequences of those scientific findings, the deniers may be in considerably less denial than a lot of professional environmentalists who paint a picture of global warming Armageddon, then reassure us that we can avert catastrophe by buying green products and creating clever pollution markets. It's just here that constructivism helps us to understand the way the empirical climate data carry social meanings related to the social and political implications in what our man here, Professor Satoon, has interestingly called meaning wars. More specifically, we can see the way that such data is translated into political policy knowledge. That is, the way evidence of warming has to be converted into knowledge that fits and is interpreted by socio-political narratives. That the numbers carry a political message when they enter the policy debate. This can be seen by examining the history of the argumentation. In the early years, climate change was put forward as an issue of risk, but later then presented as a matter of national security. The data was implicitly translated into a form of knowledge that sought to portray the numbers as implying a specific existential threat to humanity. I'm not saying they don't, but I'm saying that the numbers don't say it itself. It's attached to a story. In this regard, climate change research has been as much implicated in how to get the issue on the political agenda as it was just about collecting the numbers, presenting the numbers, and so on. Rather than just functioning as an epistemic community, climate experts did more than just marshal data. They sought to politicize it by framing it as an issue of environmental security and human survival. That is, they transformed scientific facts into political facts as well for the political discussion. For climate deniers, this is portrayed as a scare tactic, perpetrated by a truth regime made up of climate scientists, elite politicians, and deep state bureaucrats. That's too far. I had something here on a truth regime. Anyway, in this regard, climate deniers implicitly, if not explicitly, portray climate science in the public sphere as a social construction that fits with social and political meanings. It's not that they've done this because they took a course in sociology. They've actually just discovered how this works from a social constructivist perspective. Without spelling it out theoretically, they recognize that in the co-production of climate science, science is wrapped into a set of norms and institutions supported by the state that can be understood in Foucault's term, truth regime, or Jasanoff's term, similarly, a truth regime supportive of a particular society and its way of life. If there was enough time, I'd say more about the truth regime. That's something one could debate. But it suffices here to recognize that the climate deniers, whether we like it or not, are not entirely wrong to argue that climate science is connected, wittingly or unwittingly, to a political strategy. They correctly understand the societal implications to be big, but the discussions of them are never prioritized and fully considered openly and candidly in the public media. That is, the potential need for a planned society. That doesn't go over very well in the United States. A greater role for experts and restraint on individual freedoms. It's not that the numbers are wrong, but they imply that these kinds of things have to be taken seriously. The point here is not that one side does this and the other doesn't. It's rather the nature of political knowledge, that we translate the numbers into narrative understandings. In the throes of political struggle, to borrow from Alistair McIntyre, the narrative story attached to the data becomes more important than the policy and its relevant numbers. So what does this mean for policy science? Whereas the discipline has adopted a fairly narrow empirical approach, And I think we had a good explication of those type 1 and type 2 in particular approaches. The discipline should extend its practices to include a focus on political narratives and the way they are emotionally embedded in the beliefs of the competing groups. It's not a question of what we want to believe, but for our job, it's to understand how this is actually working, this process. Toward this end, policy science needs to include the practices of what is called narrative policy analysis, something that roughly exists but is on the margins of the discipline and would never be taught in a policy science course that I'm aware of. But rather than just storytelling, the emphasis would be on how the empirical findings are interpreted in the competing narratives. In particular, how policy narratives give meaning to the findings of the different actors, how emotions influence these narratives. That's a whole topic itself, but I only have 15 or 20 minutes here. And how they govern the translations to political knowledge. That is, we need to see what the empirical findings mean for the policy narratives, what are the meanings of the social and political consequences associated with the policy facts. It's not to challenge the facts. For this, policy science requires a constructivist approach to narrative policy analysis. This means turning away from a neo-positive perspective. I didn't cover that, so we come here. And returning to the original Lasswellian mission to help policymakers understand the socio-political context of the decisions that they have to make, both politicians but also citizens, including climate deniers who unfortunately are citizens. Have to concede it. Political scientists have largely failed to deal with the fact that they speak a language different than do the decision makers, as well as the way their findings are translated into political and policy knowledge by the competing perspectives. This has to be understood as an interpretive task that experts cannot make alone. The policy meanings have to be explored and tested through collective deliberation. We can't just assign these meanings ourselves. And of course, the point is that there are competing meanings. Needed then is a discursive form of narrative policy analysis that can interpret the climate findings as they relate to these stories. It also requires a discursive process that allows for the emotional expression of the narratives, for which there are actually some techniques, but beyond my time. So I just say finally, as a method for bringing facts to bear on the social and political concerns underlying climate denial, both cognitive and emotional, such a method, such a narrative policy analytic method would offer policy science a way to make a more relevant contribution in the effort to deal with this super wicked, thank you, political phenomenon. Thank you.